The release of Red Dead Redemption on PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch opens the gates for more people to enjoy Rockstar's Wild West classic. That's the good news right up front, and to keep with the positives, the Nintendo Switch version, in focus today, is an excellent fit for the hardware, uniquely giving us a way to play the game on the move as well. But yes, there's no ignoring the fact that this is still a 2010 game at its core, and as my colleague Oliver has covered in his own PS4, PS4 Pro and PS5 analysis, it just doesn't do enough, 13 years later, to drastically improve on that original experience. All of Oliver's observations of the PS4 version apply to Switch. So, it runs at 30 frames per second, and much of the HUD overlay, like the map screen, remains at 720p, just like the original Xbox 360 and PS3 releases. And fundamentally, the visual enhancements on Switch are sparing, beyond the resolution boost, which I'll get to. So for $50 or £40, is this Switch edition of Red Dead Redemption worth it on any level? How does it stack up in comparison to the other versions, particularly base PS4? And lastly, is this a locked 30 FPS on Nintendo's handheld, played docked or in portable mode? Let's find out. First up, the basics. Ported by Double 11 Studios, this Switch version has essentially the same content as on PS4. The 11.4GB install crams in the main Red Dead Redemption adventure plus the Undead Nightmare expansion, though sadly, the multiplayer mode of the original release is chopped out. And to cut to the chase, the presentation of these core story modes is at least much improved over the Xbox 360 and PS3 originals, which ran at 720p and 640p respectively. Played docked under a TV, the Switch release renders the game at a native 1920 by 1080 resolution, and in portable mode, you guessed it, the game runs at 1280 by 720, which again is a perfect pixel match for its display. So honestly, this is about as good as you could hope for on Switch in terms of the pixels being pushed, 1080p or 720p depending. In direct comparison with the Xbox 360 and PS3 originals, Red Dead Redemption's huge landscapes benefit from the boost up to 1080p on Switch. It's clearer, more defined, and reduces the flickering artifacts, the noise on fine details like fences. Immediately then, we're off to a good start with the Switch release. In fact, at 1080p, we're matching the base PS4 version's native resolution already, but native resolution isn't the only factor for image quality. Indeed, anti-aliasing type plays a big role in tidying up the shimmering, the noise, and other visual artifacts in the game, and it's here that we see Switch's first limitation, especially comparing to the PS4 image. In summary, the PS4 version of Red Dead Redemption offers a toggle for two types of anti-aliasing in its menus. First, there's FXAA, a classic post-processing anti-aliasing technique, and this is what Switch uses. However, this FXAA technique isn't as capable at handling temporal noise and shimmer as the alternative mode on PS4, AMD's FSR2. Zooming in then, the FXAA method on Switch gives similar results to PS4's. Stair-stepping artifacts are left across geometry across Armadillo Town, and on the overhanging cables and grass tufts. It's a pixel match for PS4 with FXAA, but yes, it falls short of the FSR2 results on PS4, which clean up the image much more thoroughly. In summary then, we get 1080p with FXAA on Switch, which isn't a bad result on its own terms. Needless to say, the Switch release also still presents a much clearer picture than the Xbox 360 original, running as it did at 720p, with 2x multi-sample anti-aliasing. And to go one further, there's an extra bragging right here in comparison to an Xbox One S. To this day, the base Xbox One renders the game at the same native 720p target as the 360 original via its back-compat support. And so, riding this cart up to the town for example, there's a big reduction in stair-stepping across building edges on Switch. Still though, as you might notice, other visual enhancements over the original 360 code are pretty limited. LOD settings for geometry and plants are identical, meaning buildings pop in at the exact same range on Switch as on 360. In fact, even the core texture work is identical to that 2010 release, right down to character faces in close-up. All of this we saw in the PS4 version as well, so it's not unexpected for Switch, but again, it does underline a general lack of ambition for the project as a whole. I mean, hypothetically, even adding features like ambient occlusion under grass would have gone a long way here to give the scene some depth. In its defense, there is a boost to shadow quality across the game on Switch, resulting in harder shadow outlines under the midday sun. And you might notice a slight change to the presentation of SSR, screen space reflections, on the water during the opening cutscene, but otherwise, it's really the same game. The main bonus for Switch being its 1080p boost while docked, and the ability of course to play it as a portable game. The only real downside on Switch, compared to 360 to my eyes, is the low texture filtering quality across the ground. Now going purely by eye here, this appears to be a low sample anisotropic filtering setting, which doesn't compare well to even the Xbox 360 rendition of the game. Despite the texture assets being a match between Switch and 360, their presentation at tight angles, the kind of angle you'd view the ground at while running, is often quite blurred. The last big question before we get to performance, is Switch a match for PS4 in visual settings? After all, accepting PS4 is able to use FSR2 to help with aliasing, both machines do max out at 1080p, so is there any other difference? In comparison, and inevitably, the texture filtering limit on the Switch version shows up. PS4 pushes for a higher anisotropic filtering setting, and so again expect the presentation of ground textures at an angle to be cleaner on PS4. Beyond that, foliage density is identical between the two, though there is a slight improvement to draw distances on PS4 on occasion. Note that certain trees in the distance in this shot, zoomed in, are more fully formed at range on PS4, loaded into their high quality state even at range. Generally though, pop-in across geometric elements on Switch is identical to PS4. So here's a good example. See how the rock structure on the left pops in at the exact same range on each? Neither machine excels here, and we end up with matching levels of pop-in. Now with all of that in mind, the final point of comparison is in shadow quality, which is, I'm sad to say, dropped on Switch. Note how lower resolution shadows flicker across this character's top, while PS4 stay stable. Across the game, you might notice more noise on dynamic sun-cast shadows, but in general, Switch holds up well in most scenarios. In a nutshell, the Nintendo Switch release of Red Dead Redemption runs with the same textures and geometry draw distance settings as the PS4 release. However, it also has worse shadow quality, a minor drop in foliage draw, plus lower grade texture filtering. In the main though, it's a solid and very comparable return next to PS4, all of which brings us to performance. No surprises here, it's 30 frames per second on Switch, and to be honest, bearing in mind it's running at 1080p with all these settings, it's more defensible to see 30fps here than on PS4. The Tegra X1 chipset at Switch's core isn't in the same league spec-wise as Sony's home console, and yet, we're still getting a 1080p 30fps return. Now, point number one is a huge bulk of play runs at this 30fps line, no issues whatsoever, though there are some exceptions. Firstly, just arriving at the Armadillo Saloon at night drags the performance to below 30fps, and more noticeably, the battle on the farm also has Switch drop into the high 20s. Add in a very occasional sign of uneven frame pacing at 30fps, prompting frame time spikes to 16 milliseconds, and it's certainly not perfect. Still though, so far in my testing anyway, we're getting a mostly stable 30fps experience in most areas. Overall, the turnout in performance is a success. Even the Undead Nightmare expansion, a much more taxing zombie twist on Rockstar's world, runs mostly at 30fps, and for perspective, this is a huge upgrade on the original Xbox 360 version. Looking at some older analysis footage from our archives, the 360 version struggled hugely with this graveyard battle. On original 360 hardware, it dropped close to the 20fps line with tearing, while a One S console running the 360 code cleaned the performance up. On Switch though, this graveyard area is an absolutely rock solid 30, despite the many zombies and effects on screen. And all round, it shows that the 1080p resolution is a sensible and very achievable target. As for portable play, Switch again holds out perfectly at 720p and 30fps. Again, the only exceptional point is that farmyard battle with the bandits, pulling us into the high 20s, but 99% of the time, it's still very playable. There's one final question on frame rates. Should Red Dead Redemption be targeting 60 frames per second on PS4 and Switch? Bearing in mind its age, a 13-year-old game, seeing 30 FPS on even top-end hardware like PS5 is obviously a disappointment. But as for Switch, well, getting 60 FPS on Nintendo's handheld would have been a bigger challenge. In fact, it's possible to see how it might have panned out thanks to a mod from Massa Greater. Here's a small slice of footage taken direct from a modified Switch with the game's frame rate unlocked. A few caveats here. Firstly, it's running in portable mode at a native 720p, so 1080p is off the cards. And secondly, to help it towards 60 FPS, the console's GPU clocks are boosted via a mod, doubling the default 307 MHz in portable mode up to 614. Meanwhile, the CPU jumps up from the stock 1020 MHz to 1785, while memory jumps up from 1333 up to 1996. A huge increase, and yes, with all that in mind, the graph at top left shows it's at least close to 60 FPS, often between 50 and 60. Again, I will stress this is not typical hardware. The clocks are boosted, the resolution is dropped, but if 60 FPS is within reach on Switch with these adjustments, if the game logic is still intact, why is 60 FPS not considered on more powerful hardware, especially looking at PS5? In the end, the Switch release only highlights how much more ambitious the PS4 version should have been. Given the lower power spec of Nintendo's console, the release of Red Dead Redemption on Switch is, relatively speaking, much more of a success. The 1080p 30 FPS experience here falls close to what base PS4 users are getting, that is, barring the missing FSR2 option, plus the dropped shadow and texture filtering quality. Textures, draw distances are all intact, and equally, it offers the game in portable form. In this respect, the Switch version manages to meet expectations where you'd have really hoped for more on PS4 and PS5 systems. Now, it's by no means a luxury treatment. A game of this high esteem does deserve more: improved textures, an upgraded HUD, and even perhaps 60 FPS support on higher-end consoles. Especially for the high asking price, what we're getting here is surprisingly stripped to only the essentials. But if you've yet to play the game, if you want to experience Rockstar's Western classic on the go as a portable experience, at the very least, Switch offers a way to do that today. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this analysis, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter as usual. But from me for now, thanks for watching.